Good evening. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Design, and I'm very pleased to see you all here. A quick reminder that we have live captioning available tonight for our virtual and in-person audiences. You'll see instructions and a QR code on the screen. If you have any questions, please visit Matt in the AV booth. No one ever does. So I think even if you don't have any questions, if someone can just go up and visit Matt, that would be really friendly. Let me take a moment to share a couple upcoming public programs here at the GSD. So please join us tomorrow at 12:30 in the library to celebrate the upcoming publication, Thinking Through Soil, Wastewater Agriculture in the Mezquital Valley from Harvard Design Press. And then tomorrow evening, we'll have a keynote lecture by Kjetil Tredal Thorsen, it's all Norwegian to me, founding partner of Snøhetta, who kicks off the Center for Green Buildings and Cities annual research symposium entitled Environmental Adaptations, Adaptive Environments. That symposium continues on Friday afternoon with talks by faculty and other researchers. You would never imagine that this is the last week of classes. It's amazing what happens here at this school. So please visit the GSD's website to learn more about these events or to watch others that have already taken place this semester. So tonight's event is a very special one. About 3 years ago, we were mounting an extraordinary exhibition that we had here that surveyed the work of John Andrews, the architect John Andrews, and that celebrated the 50th birthday of this building, Gund Hall, which John Andrews did. And while doing that survey, we found ourselves debating the colloquial name for room 111 of Gund Hall. It was known as the War Room because of its U-shaped fixed seating, and perhaps because it's where core studio grading often took place. Names flew about, suggestions, including the inevitable Peace Room, but the idea that ultimately took root is the one that we are celebrating tonight. Ken Stewart, who's here in front, wave your hands, Ken, embarrass you for a second. Ken Stewart, who's our Associate Dean for Communications and Public Events, is the one who suggested that we use the room naming to honor an alumnus whose relationship to the school and the university was well known, and well known to have included extreme ugliness. Ken realized that room 111 gave us an opportunity to acknowledge that history while also celebrating this alumnus, making sure that our community remember both. And you've all, I'm sure, figured out by now that that alumnus was J. Max Bond, Jr., and room 111 is now known by all as the J. Max Bond Room, or sometimes just as the Bond Room, and it's amazing how it's already taken root as a new name. I'm really grateful for that. I encourage everyone to stop by 111 either after this talk or at any other time to see the large plaque at the entrance, which tells Max's story, both the story of his important legacy as an architect and urban activist, and the story of his experience here at Harvard in the late 1950s. Additionally, there's an exhibition of photographs from Max's archives. I'll read out just the final paragraph of that plaque. Naming this classroom the J. Max Bond Room, J. Max Bond Jr. Room, celebrates the enormous influence and breadth of Bond's career and acknowledges how unwelcoming Harvard was for him and other Black students who were subjected to similar experiences at the GSD. With this dedication, the GSD inscribes Bond's name on the largest classroom at Gund Hall to give him a permanent home on Harvard's campus, even if posthumously, and to keep the memory of his experience and the legacy of his achievements alive in this school. So I want to take this moment to extend my great gratitude to Ken, who had this idea and who corresponded with Max's son Carrie and daughter Ruth, both of whom are here tonight with their families, Seth, Phoebe, Shannon, and mother-in-law. I forgot your name already, I'm sorry. Thank you, Renee. Before moving forward with the idea. So we were very anxious that this effort not be taken as a way of papering over Max's experiences here. I want to thank Carrie and Ruth for their thoughtful engagement as we've moved this project forward. As Brian Goldstein, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, I promise, notes in his upcoming book on Max, he says, "A place of possibility, Harvard was also a site of discouragement and violence, unlike any Bond had experienced in the Deep South." I also want to point out that we have at least two of Max's Harvard College classmates, Arnold Howe, also here in the front row, who's one of the 15 black classmates from Max's freshman class, and Mo Feingold, one of the 3 M's, who was Max's classmate at the college and also at the GSD. It's also a beautiful coincidence that John Andrews was also a member of their GSD class. I also want to thank Stephen Davis, who was a partner with Max for decades at Davis Brody Bond, and Sean Rickenbacker, who directs the CCNY's J. Max Bond Center for Urban Futures. I'll introduce both of them before the panel, but they were also both helpful. So again, I want to thank Ken for all he's done to make this important commemoration possible. So a key figure who helped Ken advance this project was tonight's speaker, Brian Goldstein, whom I'll introduce now. Brian, who has a Harvard hat trick, that is, he has 3 degrees from this institution, a bachelor's at the college in VES, I imagine, which was the previous name for now AFVS, these departments that change names and confuse us, and then a master's and a PhD through the GSD here at the university. Brian is an architectural and urban historian and an associate professor and chair of the art history program at Swarthmore College. Brian's research focuses on the intersection of the built environment, race and class, and social movements, especially in the United States. His publications include The Roots of Urban Renaissance, Gentrification, and the Struggle Over Harlem, which received the 2020 John Friedman Book Award from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, and the 2019 Lewis Mumford Prize for the best book in planning history. That's quite something, so that's amazing. He's currently completing a book called If Architecture Were for People, The Life and Work of J. Max Bond, Jr., which he has under contract with Princeton University Press. So here's the play of show for this evening. Brian will present this evening's short lecture entitled These Contradictory Things, Max Bond's Harvard, and we'll follow up with a conversation with 5 additional guests whom I'll introduce as we shift from Brian's talk to the panel here up front. I want to take this opportunity to thank Brian for his generosity with this project and for returning to his alma mater to share with us his research and his writing on Max Bond. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm grateful to be thanked for being here. I'm very pleased to be here, and I will only say that it is a week that being on Harvard's campus feels special and empowering, and maybe better than it would have a couple weeks ago. That's all I'll say. So I just want to begin by thanking Dean Sarah Whiting, Ken Stewart for inviting me, Raquel Rivera, Sarah Rafson, and Matt Smith for their wonderful logistical expertise. I wish to thank the wonderful people who will join in conversation after my talk, Stephen Davis, Sean Rickenbacker, David Lee, Mo Feingold, and Isabel Strauss. And I also want to express my gratitude for the generosity and kindness of Max Bond's children, Ruth and Carrie. You've patiently fielded many questions from me over the last decade in sort of the tectonic ways of a project you've enabled this book to happen, and I am very grateful to you for that. I'm glad that you can be here tonight. Remarkably, we had never met in person. I'm very glad that your families can be here too. And I just want to acknowledge Phoebe, Ruth and Seth's daughter, as well as Ben, Max, another Max, and Julian, their sons who aren't here but are hopefully watching online. Hi guys, and if not, maybe can watch after and learn more about their grandpa. I want to definitely acknowledge the presence of Arnold Howe, who Dean Whiting mentioned. Arnold was Bond's Harvard College classmate. He's the last living of the decorated group of black graduates of the class of 1955. And in 2019 and 2018, Arnold and I were intense correspondents about many of the things that I'll talk about tonight. And I'm very, very, very touched that you came, so thank you. Late in his life, architect Max Bond reflected on his time at Harvard 5 decades earlier. It was always these contradictory things, he said. By that point, Bond had reached nearly every accolade an architect could hope for. He had major projects to his name, partnership in an influential New York firm, a deanship, Ivy League chairmanship, and tenure on his resume, awards, and unusual respect among his peers in a profession with plenty of jealousy. He was, his contemporaries often said, the dean of African-American architects. Yet even still, his time at Harvard as an undergraduate from 1951 to 1955, and at the Graduate School of Design from 1954 to 1958, had scarred him, its contradictions as vivid in his mind in 2007 as they had been in 1957. As he continued, and I quote, "I think that the only reason I really survived that was because I had such strong reinforcement as a young person. So by the time I got there, I felt I was good at school. I can do that." 7 years at Harvard had taught Bond much well beyond college classrooms and GSD studios. In these august confines, Bond had experienced firsthand the blatant and latent violence of racism and also set his roots in the struggle for civil rights. He had learned to understand architecture as a tool for improving people's lives and the narrowness of that conception in the mainstream of modernism. Excuse me. When we look at this place through Bond's eyes, we find a less heroic story of Harvard in the 1950s, not as the standard bearer of modern architecture in the José Luis Sert era, but of the paradoxes it carried. We also find the story of a young person who, despite all the many reasons he might have faltered, developed confidence in the understanding that he could make a better world as both an activist and an architect. That fundamental belief would thereafter shape a career in which those two roles remained entwined. Max Bond's Harvard comprised just 7 years of his life, though those years would prove as formative for how they defined him as for how he would refuse to be defined by them. And my brief time today will allow only a glimpse into this relatively short period through vignettes that characterize a place where Bond learned both the ways that race and prejudice charge the built environment and his power, nonetheless, to use architecture to resist both. With this in mind, my talk will be a tour of sorts centered on the sites where Bond's time here unfolded. I will begin, as Bond did, at Stoughton Hall. Bond arrived to his freshman dorm on the northwest corner of Harvard Yard in fall 1951. Barely 16, he was the second youngest member of his Harvard College class and was in many ways alone. For several years, Bond's parents had been in Monrovia, where Max Sr. was president of the University of Liberia, and his siblings, George and Jane, were distant too, George at boarding school in Vermont, Jane at Sarah Lawrence. Bond had also been at boarding school for the previous 2 years, having first graduated from high school at age 13 and set to become a Morehouse man. The elder Bonds suggested that their oldest son could use some more time before college. Cambridge School of Weston provided his preparation. It was not far from a farther Boston suburb to a nearer one, though Bond's parents were not there to help with the move. In Stoughton, too, Bond was alone, the only black student in its halls, though decidedly not the only black student in the class of 1955. In fact, Bond's year marked something of a watershed. In preceding years, Harvard had typically enrolled just a few black students in each class, 3, sometimes 4. Bond's year, in contrast, had 15. Hardly evidence of a boldly integrated campus, their growing number did speak to a college that, in comparison to its Ivy League peers, was usually more indifferent than antagonistic. Housing was an exception to the rule. At Harvard, as in much of the US, color lines were boldest where residence was concerned. In the early 1900s, under bigoted university president Abbott Lawrence Lowell, rules of black exclusion from dorms that had been social practice became policy. Housing discrimination was off the books, by the time Bond arrived, but one did not need to look too hard to see that the yard remained an effectively segregated space. Housing applications required a photograph, and the locations of Bond's classmates indicated that the housing office was looking closely. 3 neighboring dorms, Hollis, Holworthy, and Stoughton, housed 3/4 of the on-campus black freshmen, many as roommates. I'll just point out Arnold Howe and his twin brother, Alan, in these pictures. 3 other of these 15 were scattered among the other 9 dorms. A few steps connected nearly all of the class's black students, including Bond. Without a doubt, that concentration drew the interest of 2 of Bond's white classmates when, on an unseasonably mild February night, they bound 2 bamboo poles at a right angle, wrapped them in rags and kerosene, and set them ablaze before Stoughton Hall. Bond would have seen the light reflecting from his yard-facing second-floor room, and did. It would only have taken him a few seconds to descend the stairs and exit to a 5-foot-tall cross burning in Harvard Yard. After 10 minutes of conflagration, some students knocked the cross down. Others, inspired by the act of animus, jeered black students. Initially, Bond sat with the event upon returning to his dorm room. The most Southern of his black classmates, Bond had experienced the quotidian savagery of Jim Crow segregation, but until he came to Harvard, had not witnessed personally an event as ugly as this one. When a week passed and there was no public acknowledgement, and then another week passed, Bond and his classmate James Boone Jr. decided to speak up. "Fiery Cross" read the title of their February 21st letter to the Harvard Crimson, as they wrote, "On the evening of Tuesday, February 5th, an incident occurred in the Harvard Yard, knowledge of which has been confined to those students in the corner of the yard in which it took place." Telling their story, knowledge did not remain confined. The next day, the Boston Post, one of the city's major papers, ran a large, bold headline, "Burning Cross is Seen at Harvard." When the AP picked up the story, it quickly traveled the country to Baltimore and Huntsville, North Adams and Paducah, Sioux Falls and Philadelphia. The media frenzy was its own lesson, as the Post's misquote of Bond's assessment of the event as a stupid, vicious prank directly contradicted Bond and Boone's own letter. "We do not feel that this demonstration can be dismissed as a prank," they had written. The infamous Post article, Bond characterized it to his parents. More lessons revealed themselves in the divergent reactions to a 16-year-old making this story public. The college, for its part, proved minimizing at best, self-protective, and wrong-headed at worst. After Bond blew the story open, the freshman dean denounced it as a deplorable incident, in his words, while qualifying it as exceptional. Student groups across the college largely condemned it. If extreme, however, the cross burning mirrored a larger reality of quiet racism on campus. Bond's friend group was notably integrated, but there were limits, both explicit and subtle, on the freedom of black Vardians. Weekend socializing was often segregated. Final clubs, bastions of the college's elite, remained closed to black members. 5 days after Bond and Boone's letter, the college's dean announced that 2 freshmen, who remained unnamed, had been put on probation. It was, the perpetrators explained, a prank, the very word that Bond had rejected. But the freshman dean also summoned Bond, Boone, and other black classmates who had talked with the press. "They chastise us for having talked to the paper," Arnold Howe told me. In contrast, Bond's parents, following from afar, saw the fruit of their efforts to raise children who did not sit passively in the face of prejudice. At Harvard, Bond had quickly joined the college's NAACP chapter, the Harvard Society for Minority Rights. 3 days after the cross burning, he became the group's vice president. Surely the group emboldened his will to make the violence public, but the letter's authorship suggested that Bond and Boone had acted on their own. Amid the fog of reactions to the event, Bond wrote to his parents, "Do you feel that it was unwise to write the letter and that it did harm to race relations here?" His father's reply came unambiguously. "That was a great thing that you did. I was wondering whether you were mouse or man. I guess you are the type of guy that I want you to be." Knowing that it would take a while for that to reach his son coming from Monrovia, he followed it with a telegram the same day. "Congratulations, cross response, excellent, Dad." His mother concurred. "All of us here commend you for your stand. You had no alternative." It was an intentionally disruptive, even radical act, and more so in the context of Bond's age and identity, the college's culture of conformity and politeness, and the national purge of McCarthyism. A couple weeks after the college handed down its discipline, the noted black communist William Patterson visited campus, having recently presented "We Charge Genocide" to the United Nations, his famous condemnation of U.S. treatment of African Americans. He told his Harvard audience plainly, "You burn a cross to terrorize Negroes." Bond would not have agreed with Patterson's politics at this time, but certainly agreed with his assessment. He never forgot the fiery cross in front of Stoughton and referred to it in nearly any discussion of his Harvard years. The cross's arrival before the most private of spaces on Harvard's campus gave Bond a first-hand view on how even an iconic built environment could become an instrument in the project of racial terror. It also catalyzed his determination to speak up. It was no wonder that gazing upon the buildings of Harvard Yard, Bond preferred not the Georgian garb of his dorm, but the precedent-breaking modernism of Lamont, the undergraduate library that had opened a few years prior. Weeks after his arrival, he sent his parents an assessment of the first completed post-war building at Harvard and the first campus building to adopt modernism. As he wrote to them, "The undergraduate library here, Lamont, is quite modern and is really beautiful." Lamont was wonderful in his words. "It is simply wonderful. The building is very modern with all sorts of fancy lighting, floor plans, and equipment." If ever there was a training ground for the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite in the US, it was Harvard Yard. And if ever there was an architecture symbolic of that role, it was Georgian and the Georgian and Georgian revival style that characterized many of the Yard's buildings, a style that Stoughton both typified and indeed prototyped. Constructed in 1698 as the first dedicated dorm on campus, Stoughton was true Georgian, a style that university officials maintained when they rebuilt the building in 1805. When the college embarked on a campaign of building in the early 20th century to construct the new undergraduate houses that President Lowell offered as his vision of the proper and demographically narrow college community, their neo-Georgian dress looked to the precedent of Stoughton and its neighbors. And just an architectural historian's note, Stoughton was real Georgian. Stoughton became the model, as did Hollis, for the buildings that Harvard built. And needless to say, every college campus in the country, with few exceptions, has a Georgian building. So Stoughton is kind of patient zero in many ways. Ironically, as an upperclassman, Bond would live in the very house named after Lowell, Lowell House. But Bond found comfort, even warmth, in the explicit rejection from all that staged by Lamont. He reserved special affection for what he called the record room. This, the Woodbury Poetry Room, had been designed by the Finnish modernists Aino and Alvar Aalto. Their human-centered, organic modernism contrasted with the machine aesthetic and rationalism of their contemporaries. With bent plywood furniture, cork floors, wood screens and paneling, and listening stations that joined students in collective absorption, Bond sensed the room's distance from pure functionalism without knowing its story. Not yet an architect, Bond had found a humane corner of modernism that suited him well in Lamont's brick and glass walls. As much as Lamont's appeal indicated a propensity for architecture, the reality was that Bond's was not a story of childhood obsession or a foreordained career. Asked in his application if he had an intended occupation, Bond simply answered no. He indicated an interest in the physical sciences. Max Sr. suggested other options: atomic medicine, law, industrial design, and architecture. When he had to pick a concentration at the end of freshman year, Bond chose architectural sciences. He wavered throughout the next year, but stuck with it. That meant that Bond would spend much of his 7 years in and around another neo-Georgian building, the McKim, Mead, and White designed Robinson Hall, where, along with now demolished Hunt Hall, architectural sciences and his graduate training were centered. For a college that shunned professional training at the undergrad level, architectural sciences was exceptionally practical. A concentration in architectural sciences pointed to a career in architecture, a professional path that appealed to the Bonds. Bond had seen firsthand the struggles that attended his parents' careers, even as members of the African-American intellectual elite. Riches did not follow his father's climb up the academic ladder. Moreover, in academic positions and the diplomatic posts that followed, Max Sr. had chafed against a lack of independence. He sought greater stability and self-determination for his oldest son, a promise that he saw in a profession. As he wrote in 1956, a year after arriving in Kabul for a US government position, and I quote, "I am still battling the white folks out here. They are just as mean and cussed as you would find in Mississippi. But when you are a wage slave without a profession, you take it and you take it until you die. That's the way life goes." Bond's preparation over his first 3 years built a surprisingly heterodox foundation for his professional entry, indicative of years that would see the departure of Walter Gropius in 1952 and arrival of Jose Luis Sert in 1953. Bond took Joseph Hudnut's Art in Man's Environment in 1952-53, the GSD dean's last year at Harvard. Against Gropius's dismissal of history, Hudnut argued for a humanistic modernism involving what he called human values, community, and individuality. With Kenneth Conant also sidelined by Gropius, Bond gained a decidedly Eurocentric but often eclectic view of history, encompassing medieval architecture, Native American architecture, and modernism too. It was here that Bond learned about Le Corbusier, whose work he found especially exciting, and who, by decade's end, Bond would experience firsthand in Paris. In landscape architect Norman Newton, the architectural sciences chair, Bond would find a low-key and kind presence among clashing egos, a personality that matched Bond's own. The undeniable reality was that Bond's blackness made him peculiar in the college, in his major, and in the field of architecture. When the GSD reinstated a program that allowed architectural sciences majors to take their first year of graduate school as seniors, Bond, not yet 20, went for it. That put him on the path to becoming the 5th black GSD graduate and the first to also attend Harvard College. Bond's profile was extraordinarily rare. In 1950, the US Census counted 180 black architects against 23,300 white ones. Most of those few black architects had learned their craft at historically black universities. Not coincidentally, many of the most prominent black architects like Hilliard Robinson, John Lewis Wilson, and Louis Fry Sr., the first black graduate of the GSD, had gone to Ivy League schools. Those universities taught design from a position of privilege, not as a theoretical pursuit, not as a trade, and emboldened students to run their own firms. At the GSD, Bond gained entry into an institution that aimed, as one faculty member then described, and I quote, "not to educate draftsmen, but to educate the men who will run the whole works." His early arrival into graduate school came at a moment of transition. At a low point with the departure of Gropius and Hudnut, the GSD had both a morale and financial deficit until the appointment of Jose Luis Sert. Arriving with impeccable modernist credentials, the Spanish Sert also was in the midst of steering the field's direction in the 1950s away from strict functionalism and toward more expressionistic, humanistic forms. As the Crimson reported, his arrival had brought, in their words, sincere enthusiasm and a new spirit. His many faculty additions represented this point of view while maintaining ties to European modernism. Their number included architects Serge Chermayeff, Albert Szabo, Siegfried Gideon, and Edward Seckler, all of whom would teach Bond. Bond came into this milieu with confidence. He later remembered a challenging admissions interview with the Russian-born Chermayeff. After a rough start, Chermayeff became, in Bond's words, a little more accepting of the fact of Bond's admission because I was by then pretty determined. Bond had reason to be. He graduated from college in 1955 with magna cum laude honors and membership in Phi Beta Kappa, an achievement that fulfilled his family's dreams. As his uncle, the noted educator Horace Mann Bond, told Max Sr., the highest academic distinction ever in the family. Norman Newton's Phi Beta Kappa nomination spoke to a studious student with a larger understanding of the world. As he wrote, with insistent intellectual curiosity, keen intelligence, gentle independence, and sturdy application, he has addressed himself to the task of self-development, but never without an evident sense of his social responsibility as a human individual. In this context, Bond's start at the GSD brought profound disappointment. The problem began with one of CERT's new hires, Joseph Zalewski. Zalewski, a favorite of many of Bond's GSD contemporaries, had a reputation as an excellent designer and instructor. As Fumihiko Maki remembered, among the students who got to know him well, many praised him unreservedly as a great teacher. Bond had a very different experience, however, which he invoked to the end of his life without publicly naming the perpetrator. Zalewski taught Bond in the year-long design research course he took in 1954-55, his first year at the GSD, as well as in his second-year studio. At some point during that first year, Bond later recounted, and I quote, "Zalewski took me aside and said, 'Mr. Bond, there have never been any successful black or Negro architects, and you seem like a bright young man. Why don't you pick another profession?'" Such misbegotten advice was something of a rite of passage for black architects, but it seared Bond, for whom any profession had seemed possible. It symbolized a larger dynamic at the GSD in which some students of color, though not all, as Maki shows, and women had a very different experience than their peers. Notably, the historian Dolores Hayden, a GSD student in the next decade, wrote in 1970 of Zalewski's antagonism toward the GSD's Urban Field Service, an advocacy program in low-income Boston communities. As she quoted Zalewski, "If you want to work for these black people," and she notes parenthetically, the clients actually happen to be white, continuing, "you should quit school. This work has no place in the school." Bond had excelled at Harvard to this point, yet he struggled in the second-year studio that Zalewski taught with Houston Jackson. In design problems ranging from a house to a neighborhood, Bond received nearly all D-range grades, by far his worst year. "This has been the hardest year of my career," Bond reflected, even before the end of the fall semester. Halfway through his studies at the GSD, discouragement rang in Bond's ears. Where GSD studios did not offer Bond affirmation, they provided a foil against which he could measure the realities that he knew to be true, the realities that had been drilled into him by parents who knew to expect such obstacles. For example, the claim that there were no successful black architects. Bond had certainly not learned about any at Harvard. He had learned about them on his own, and in the weeks after Zalewski's ignorant counsel, Bond made a plan. "I have hatched a rather wild scheme, which you probably won't approve of," he told his parents in spring 1955. Bond had written to Paul Revere Williams, the most successful black architect in the world, I'll go back to Williams for now, seeking summer employment in his LA office. Bond's parents loved the idea, though it did not pan out immediately. He had inquired too late for 1955, but Bond's subsequent experience only hardened his resolve. Pounding the pavement in Boston and New York looking for summer work, Bond gained only a sweat-stained suit and the false platitudes of everyday discrimination. Many firms told Bond they were moving. He sensed the lies. During his difficult second year, however, Bond got good news. Williams had a place for him in summer 1956. Williams had an astounding story. An LA native, he had launched his firm in the 1920s amid the city's residential boom. In the process, he gained prominence designing both small and big houses, becoming a favorite of white affluent clients, even despite his blackness. His reputation among Hollywood royalty led to more commissions, department stores, offices, hotels, and more. Versatile, canny in his use of racial identity, in his explanation, Williams would sniff at the budgets of skeptical clients, making them eager to prove themselves. And part of the city's black elite, Williams became a powerhouse by the mid-1950s when Bond eyed him as a model. Just as Bond was awaiting news from Williams, another fortunate circumstance buoyed his confidence. In New York for New Year's Eve, 1955, Bond met a young architecture student, Jay Johnson, who was in many ways his mirror image. Son of Charles S. Johnson, the first black president of Fisk University, and attending Columbia, Jay had been planning to work for Williams in the upcoming summer too. The Johnsons and Bonds knew each other in the small world of black intellectuals, yet the two sons had not met. When they did, Bond found a potential roommate and a friend, who showed the plausibility of his hopes. When both received their offer letters, Bond's brother George, who'd been attending Boston University, decided to join too. To get to LA, they enacted an American ritual, the road trip west, shaped in their case by their identity as young black men. The highway, especially Route 66, symbolized possibility and peril. It also offered a chance to get away from Harvard that proved formative. The drive, as Jay Johnson later told me, unfolded in an era when cross-country trips like ours were more fun to read about than to experience. In Johnson's Pontiac convertible, they made their way from Philadelphia to Dayton to Louisville, where Bond's extended family lived, to Nashville with the Johnsons. Continuing west, they caught Route 66 in Oklahoma. Through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, they couldn't avoid the circumscribed freedom of movement of the Jim Crow South and West. In Fort Smith, Arkansas, they leaned on a method Johnson had used before, asking the owner-manager of a railroad motel to put them up at home. In Amarillo, they relied on the Negro Traveler's Green Book to find a hotel. Other perils were equal opportunity. A flat tire in Ohio, broken wheel in Kentucky, 2 new tires in Adrian, Texas, before entering the barren desert. Still, the week-long drive was an exciting introduction to both new friends and new places, a reminder of the ways race constantly shaped space in the U.S., and a fitting prelude to a summer that demonstrated the possibility of black autonomy in the built environment. Bond was intrigued by the Western landscape, if not by the intense heat that made their journey very trying. George saw echoes of Afghanistan, where he had lived with his parents before Boston. The unending desert also made a fitting prelude to the city beyond. At the end of the journey, LA was a welcome sight. Max, George, and Jay Johnson settled into an apartment on South Manhattan Place in Jefferson Park amid a black middle-class neighborhood whose integration had been a subject of Max Sr.'s USC dissertation. That LA experience had set Bond's father on his own career path. In LA, Max Jr. would gain a tremendous amount too, especially from the mentorship of Williams, who wasted no time in putting Bond and Johnson into the thick of it. Days after arriving, Bond was already on the job site of the Los Angeles County Courthouse, a joint venture for his boss. By summer's end, the architecture students had worked on the design of a Beverly Hills hotel, a shopping center, a Mercedes-Benz showroom, and most exciting, a low-slung modernist house for Frank Sinatra. Movie stars who have seen it call it the finest small house in Hollywood, Ebony magazine said in 1957. Bond worked on the kitchen's tile floor, which incorporated Sinatra's initials, and a bar. Jay worked on a decorative railing in the foreground of this photo, also initialed. Williams put Bond and Johnson's handprints on highly visible work. In his integrated office with white people working for him, they saw a figure who had not compromised his ambition in a hostile world. In his stylistic flexibility, they found an architect respectful of and shaped by what clients wanted and the context in which he worked. Even as it adopted more humanist directions, the GSD still followed a narrow modernist path. Most certainly a bottom-up approach was not part of that. Williams offered an alternative to those expectations. Bond also learned much from the experience of LA as a city. The young men enjoyed LA's black social world. Brought close to the city's elite, they had beach parties with the daughter of the chart-topping Mills brothers and met Nat King Cole and his daughters. Beyond sun and celebrity, Bond and Johnson also witnessed the experimental currents that made California modernism especially lively. They liked work by Craig Elwood and Richard Neutra, as Bond later wrote, another architect barely discussed at Harvard. LA showed them modernism as a journey with many paths. The city also provided a negative example. As much as this experience was empowering, Bond was ambivalent about LA itself. In awe of its sprawl, he found his people, as he said, fantastic and extravagant. This is kind of impressive that in 1956 he already thought LA people were fantastic and extravagant. The freeways were terribly impressive, he said, but were, and I quote, symbolic of a city not really made for humans. New York, Bond decided, was more for him. He preferred the sidewalk life of New York, the dependence on one's feet, its centripetal form, its many people. These were useful epiphanies as Bond prepared to head back east. Returning from LA proved less a transition than a crash landing. LA had been an experience of freedom for the Bonds. Leaving it reminded them of the constraints that awaited them. The return drive itself made that clear. Reaching the Midwest, Bond recounted, "We were back in the land of segregation, as we found out when we stopped to get something to eat in a small town." That put them in a bad mood for the remainder of the day, but arriving in Cambridge was worse. Max and George started looking for a new apartment around Harvard on September 17th. 2 weeks later, they were still looking. As Bond told his parents, "The reason was not that all of the places were taken, but that we were Negroes. I was appalled, as were all my friends." Bond's demanding third year at the GSD had begun, but they were going from couch to couch. Jim Crow wasn't on the books here, but he was present. As Bond said, "There is segregation here, though subtler. The situation came through subterfuge. The landlord of 122 Mount Auburn Street in Harvard Square was also racist. He would not rent to African Americans, but the black superintendent looked the other way. A white friend signed the lease for Max and George." The experience was not atypical for black renters in Harvard Square. When architect Robert Madison, the fourth black GSD graduate, arrived for his master's studies in the early 1950s, he couldn't find anyone near campus who would rent to him. Finally able to focus on school, Bond reflected, "It was the only place we could find. The situation is really bad and very disappointing, especially since one expects so much of the North." Bond's first years at the GSD had been disappointing too, and in some of the same ways. Yet, in its better moments, the school offered lessons that he would take with him. This was the GSD's paradox for Bond. On one hand, under CERT, it centered the question of the modern city in dynamic new ways, teaching students that architects had a meaningful contribution to make. On the other hand, Bond's experiences of his own blackness revealed the limitations of this approach as it was taught at mid-century. Modernist urbanism barely paid attention to the entrenched racial inequality that made even getting an apartment nearly impossible for Bond. But time in Robinson Hall helped Bond to see a role for himself in shaping better cities, a vision that he would hone thereafter for the benefit of the people that modern urbanists had often left out. CERT's influential work shaping the field of urban design embodied these tensions. In an era when many were leaving the city behind, CERT called for rebuilding urban centers. In his humanism, he imagined cities with pedestrian-friendly urban cores, human-scaled buildings, and vital public life. This became the basis for a new discipline that joined design fields toward a vision of civic culture and social improvement. These goals underpin many of the classes that Bond took, including the Human Scale Seminar, the architectural history sequence taught by Siegfried Gideon and Edward Seckler, and the final year design studio. Seckler, who recommended Bond for a Fulbright in 1957, encouraged his students to ask a simple question. In his words, "How does what I design make the lives of the people who will use it better and happier?" Despite such democratic impulses, the urban design conversation at the GSD lacked any significant discussion of race. That absence reflected the conceptual nature of CERT's vision, which celebrated a romanticized ideal of public life while omitting consideration of the complex factors that had brought U.S. cities to their present state. This was a rather curious oversight given the profound centrality of race in the story of the post-war city. The flight of white middle-class residents, declining public resources and housing discrimination that greeted black migrants, and urban redevelopment caused displacement were all abundantly clear just down the street in Boston, yet none received serious attention at the GSD. Urban design's myopia was on full display at the public debut of CERT's efforts, the 1956 Harvard Urban Design Conference, which Bond attended. A summit of leading designers, public officials, and scholars, the event also included several redevelopment leaders who, in various ways, had taken advantage of federal largesse to experiment with reconstruction. One of them, Pittsburgh Mayor David Lawrence, used the occasion to describe, in his words, the massive slum clearance of the city's Lower Hill neighborhood. 2/3 of the Lower Hill's nearly 1,900 families were black. Over 1,500 of its families were displaced. As Lawrence said then, the redevelopment of the Lower Hill will be the greatest of our Pittsburgh projects. Bond did not record his response to Lawrence's cheery remarks about the mass dislocation of African Americans, but his reaction to the conference did evince his engagement with the very topics omitted from his architectural training. Bond gravitated to the one presenter who brought racial inequality to the fore, housing expert Charles Abrams. Abrams' recent book, Forbidden Neighbors, a study of prejudice in housing, had slammed federal policy. In particular, Abrams focused on the government's role in driving suburban exclusion, famously arguing that the Federal Housing Administration had, and I quote, adopted a racial policy that could well have been culled from the Nuremberg laws. Abrams offered deeper explanation for problems that most of his fellow panelists were confronting only physically, as he told his Harvard audience, the new suburbs with their thousands of little links transcribing the teeming, heaving cities now proclaim the no trespass sign. Bond picked up on Abrams' critique of capitalism, under which he argued overcrowded cities would always be profitable for those who owned the land. In a racist housing market, there would always be people to overfill the houses open to them. This point, Bond wrote his parents, is so seldom made, but it is very true. Suggesting his prior expectations of this event, he wrote, I was surprised that it got said. Abrams agreed with Sert and his faculty that architects should be thinking about improving cities for their inhabitants, but differed in his understanding of what that meant. Bond's ambivalence about the GSD was bound up in this tension. He benefited from the energy that had re-entered its halls 5 years after Sert's arrival. Yet he saw Robinson Hall and the world beyond it through a different lens than his peers as he witnessed unfolding struggles over racism as an observer and participant. Indeed, while Bond watched from afar the fraught integration of Little Rock Central High School in fall 1957, he was making his way through his final year-long studio taught by Sert. Getting in was already a feat. 8 of 24 classmates had failed to proceed from the third year. Those who made it primarily focused on designing what were called residential sectors that balanced low density of suburbs and high density of typical urban redevelopment. Students examined 2 sites, one in working class Billerica, the other southwest of Cambridge's Central Square. The results, with a range of low, medium, and high-rise housing, responded to both ongoing rapid development of rural land into suburbia and the departure of the middle class from city limits. Though just an academic exercise, the studio's final designs gained outsized attention, including a well-illustrated article in Architectural Forum. In the neighborhood between Central Square and the Charles River, Forum explained, typical wood frame tenements would be cleared and rebuilt in 9 developer areas. A smaller area would be rehabilitated, but neither Architectural Forum nor the studio publication nor the studio assignments paid any attention to the existing residents beyond their removal. None noted that these streets defined the center of Cambridge's black community, nor that the city exhibited sharp residential segregation. Where Bond lived in the square, after much effort, less than 1% of residents were black in 1960. Where GSD students were practicing the techniques of clearance and redevelopment, the Cambridgeport neighborhood it's called, about 19% of current residents were black. Yet race simply did not come up in the conversation, even as future architects were learning their responsibility to build more humane cities. Bond would return to this disparity often. Race did come up in one conversation late in Bond's final year as he and classmates Mo Feingold and Masao Itabashi considered their futures. Self-appointed as the 3 M's for Mo, Maz, and Max, all had been trained at a school that filled the design professions with leaders, but they understood that their roads would diverge. Feingold, who's here, we'll hear from him soon, is Jewish, and he was one of a handful of Jewish students in the class. As he told me a few years ago, the reaction was, I wouldn't have any trouble. With violent anti-Semitism a recent memory, Feingold said, they agreed that there was a problem, but it wasn't a visual one. Itabashi was Japanese American, one among a few East Asian students in their class. At age 10, the US government had uprooted his family from their LA home and incarcerated them at Gila River internment camp in Arizona. 16 years later, they agreed that his prospects would be okay, but dimmer than Feingold's. Bond went last. Still the only African American in their class and one of only 2 at the GSD, the 3 M's knew that Bond's road would be the toughest. Bond had learned that too at the GSD. He was ready to leave. As he wrote that semester to his parents, I suppose I should savor all of the remaining time, though I will be glad to get away from here, I think. What did it mean to get away? Practically, Bond was looking to Tunisia, where his parents were then stationed, and Paris, where he hoped to travel on a Fulbright. Both places appealed to a young internationalist, and both would indeed become part of Bond's near future. More symbolically, getting away meant escaping from the typical patterns and omissions Bond had witnessed stateside, all encompassed by his time at Harvard. Getting away meant getting away from Harvard. As Bond later recalled, he left and would stay away for, in his words, many years. I didn't go back for years. At the earliest, he returned to deliver a lecture at the GSD in 1968. Decades passed before he attended a reunion. I must say there was quite a bit of bitterness on my part at that time, he remembered. Harvard carried enormous symbolic weight among institutions of higher education and maintained no less a storied place in the history of architectural modernism. Bond saw it differently. Harvard had empowered Bond to believe he could shape the built environment toward a better future and shown him the many forms of racial violence that architecture and planning could enact. It had forced encounters with spaces of oppression and driven his search for spaces of liberation elsewhere, far beyond the gates of Harvard Yard. Contradictory, these lessons would stay with him. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Beautiful talk, and also a nice chance for us to hear what you're like as a teacher, which was really wonderful. Your students are very lucky. Let me introduce this panel. So I will go in order from going to my right, my buddy David Lee.
But
so,
Sarah, you always go to your left.
You're right. So David Lee, who graduated with an MAUD in 1971, is the president of Stoll & Lee, an architecture, urban design, and planning firm here in Boston. He's taught here at the GSD, among other schools, and I'll note that we overlapped when I was teaching here long ago as a junior faculty member, and he remains a cherished colleague. With his late business partner, Donald Stoll, Mr. Lee received the NOMA's Architects Lifetime Achievement Award, as well as the Harvard GSD Distinguished Alumni Award. Mo Feingold, who we've already heard some introduction of. Mo, who graduated from the college in 54 and from the GSD in 58, I like your bio, so I'm going to read it pretty directly. He was licensed to practice architecture in 1961. I like that phrasing. You established your office in 1964, and he notes that he worked with 7 of his GSD classmates during those 57 years. His focus has been on creating spaces and places for people with an eye for details that speak to time and place. He's extremely pleased that 2 of his classmates, John Andrews and Max Bond, are now forever an integral part of the Gun Hall legacy. Sean Rickenbacker, who's next, is an architect, urbanist, and urban data researcher. He's currently the director of the CCNY J. Max Bond Center for Urban Futures at CCNY and an associate professor of architecture at their Spitzer School of Architecture. His research and work confront the intersection of spatial equity and the socioeconomic impact of place-based politics, programs, and design. It's a problem with having pages that don't come apart easily. Stephen Davis is managing director of the New York City office at Page, and until 2023 was a partner at Davis Brody Bond. A lifelong New Yorker, Stephen has developed a focus on spaces that express the relationship between the user, the physical environment, and the surrounding community. You've met Brian. And our last panelist is Isabel Strauss, who graduated from the GSD in 2021, sorry. You look fabulous. She also graduated from the college in 2013, I'll note. She's an architectural designer from Chicago, and for the past 3 years has worked in the curatorial department at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, assisting on projects related to architecture and design, and I'm delighted to announce that this fall she begins a new chapter in her young career as an assistant professor of architecture and art at Smith College. which is great. So I deliberately noted on your bios how many of you are focused on the relationship of space, place, and people. And I think that that's one thing that unites you and in part unites how you're on this panel and tied to Max Bond. I guess the sort of obvious softball question to put out to this group, though I ask that you not speak at great length because we are so many, is simply reflecting on your relationship to Max. And I want to start with Mo, who I know actually prepared some text because he's such a good student.
Thank you. I made some notes because at my age I wander sometime. So Max and I were classmates, as you've already heard, for 4 years from 1954 to 58. It took 4 years then to get a Master in Architecture degree. I hope it's shorter now, but there were about 40 of us in architecture. But the class was ever changing because of the fluxes of military service. People were leaving for the military, coming back from the military. But there was a core of about 10 of us who began in the GSD in the fall of '54, who made it through, straight through those next 4 years. In the last year, we were joined by many from around the world. Most of them, in fact, all but one, were from above the equator, and one was from below the equator. And that, of course, was John Andrews, not only my classmate, but became a dear friend as well as a business colleague. Max, like most of us, were quiet and conscientious students. I remember one project especially. It was in elementary school. It was in our 3rd year, and we teamed together to design this elementary school. It was Max, 2 others, and myself. And Max took upon himself the task of designing the spaces for the kindergarten. And why? Because he wanted to have, what was special about this kindergarten, this 3rd year design school, they had open fireplaces, not building codes withstanding. He thought the idea of having a hearth was a good place for young kindergarten students to have organized for storytelling and reading. You've heard the story about, at the end of our year, about the 3 M's, Max, Moss, and Mo. But it was after graduation, I've spent some time in the military, and after that, when I came back, I was walking down a street in Boston from where I had a job, and I bumped into Max, and we had a conversation on the street. He couldn't get a job in Boston, and he was leaving. And of course, the rest of that is history, as you've heard about. The thing that was poignant to me in this thinking about Max is, in those early postgraduate years, then Dean Sert had started the annual Urban Design Conference. And it attracted many of the class back year after year. And in so doing, since we were such a close-knit small group of us, we had dinners together. And having been elected the marshal for commencement, I became the class de facto chair and started to organize reunions of the 10th, the first ever reunions of the GSD, of the 10th, 25th, 40th, and 50th classes. People came from all over, especially for the 40th. John came from Sydney, Yoshi came from Japan, Pilar from Mexico, Lex from Holland, etc., and more others. Max never came. We tried. The committee's chairs, the committees, or friends in New York, Mike Zimmer, Dave Spector, classmates, we could never get Max to come. We never knew why. We thought it was his anger towards us for some reason. I bumped into him at an AIA conference a few years later, and he embraced me with a big smile and a big hug, and he said to me 2 words, "You understood." I think it is wonderful he was the architect for the expansion of the Harvard Club of New York City, a place that would not have let him in those early years. I'm also very pleased, as has been said, that 2 of my classmates of this class of 1958, John Andrews and now Max Bond, are an integral and forever part of the GSD. And I thank all of those who have made the Max Bond Room possible.
I wanted to turn next to Stephen, because you were partners with him for so long. So can you step in and tell us about your reflections?
I'm not sure how you summarize 20-plus years in... Professionally, I'm not even going to try. But Max was my friend. He had an absolutely wicked sense of humor. But he also had an acerbic side. So he was great when he was happy, but when he was pissed off, he was a real handful. He touch typed, which he told me he was taught as a child because that's what black children are taught. And I was really impressed by that. Not the teaching part, but the ability. And he had an incredible sense of humor. He walked into my office one day and he said, "You know, Steve, you know you're getting old when the white girls will sit next to you on the subway." So, you know, we were buddies, and Gene and Max and I had shared a lot of stuff, a lot of years. So I have to observe that if you're sitting where the audience is, they're all on the left, just coincidentally. Anyway, Carrie and Ruthie and your families, thank you for all the wonderful times. And I just want to conclude, Dean Whiting, by saying that we're all alive as long as we're remembered.
It's very nice. Thank you. I'm going to skip around and put Isabel on the spot, someone who is a little different than everyone else on this panel in that you didn't have a direct relationship to Max Bond, but...
Even though I graduated in 19... no, I feel like I'm the only one who didn't know Max, or, you know, I didn't work with him, I didn't study him, I wasn't his friend. I didn't know about Max until my second year at Harvard, and I was working on the Nexus, and I was searching desperately for architects to write about, and architects' papers and archives, and I didn't know where to look, and he was one of the first people I found. So I'm really grateful for this room, for the students who are coming to the GSD and the students who are looking for people to look up to and for stories to connect to. And, you know, I'm happy to be here now, and it would have been really wonderful to have this work on display in 111 when I was here. It would have made a big difference. So thank you for everyone who's made this happen.
Thank you. Thank you. David.
I'm going to put this in spatial terms. Everybody in this room has some place in their lives where if you mention that place, you take a moment to sigh. That's the way I feel about Max Bond, and a whole bunch of us do. You mention Max's name and you'd pause for a moment. He had that kind of presence. I've often said that Max is literally the dean of all black architects. He had that kind of awareness. And you know, as preparing for this thing, Max was a great guy. I mean, he was collegial and so forth, probably one of the most worldly and sophisticated people I know. Yet, when I went through some of the background material for tonight, and I'm from a family of very well-educated people, reasonably well-educated myself, but I got to tell you, I was intimidated. I started the University of Illinois architecture school barely 17. I turned 17 August 31st and started school, I don't know, September 6th or something like that. But I can't even imagine what it must have been like for Max here in those times. But literally, Max is just a guy you got to take a moment and just sigh, because he had that kind of presence and that kind of impact on so many people. And I actually met him when he was at Arch. I was in New York and made a point of going to Harlem and meet him. And he tried to hire me, but I stayed in Philadelphia and then came here a couple of years later. But I loved the guy, I really did. Oh, one last thing. I searched and searched and searched to find my last email from Max, which I kept for years, but I couldn't find it. But the title of the email was The Desperate World of Black Architects. He was tough right to the end.
Sean, you carry Max's name at your job, right? So tell us what that weight of the name is of the
yes.
Max Bond Center.
Well, yes, the legacy lives on, and is how we look at it. The J. Max Bond Center for Urban Futures at the City College of New York, where I'm the director. The center, with the help of Davis Brody Bond, was named in 2012. I'm the second director in that legacy. And the mission stays quite similar. We are the school's applied research center for social and spatial justice. There's an emphasis on working in New York. And I need to kind of recognize a few people. I met Max as a towering figure, talk about intimidating. And my family's from New York, primarily Harlem. And many of my parents and friends knew of Max, but didn't know him personally. So occasionally I would hear this comment that he has to meet Max. Karen Phillips, for those who might know, storied career, landscape architect. Stephen has worked with her in New York, arranged a symposium where I was able to meet him. And as many of us know the saying, which he bestowed upon me, which was, to those that much is given, much is owed in return. And I think I shrunk a few inches after hearing that, understanding exactly what he meant. And so it's really an honor to be able to carry his name with the work that we're doing now. But I think it was his moral clarity, and every time I saw and heard him speak about architecture, what I've learned from Stephen, certainly what I've learned from Brian, that conviction and that moral clarity, I think is, again, what we're trying to do at the center, perhaps through different means, but certainly that compass directs what we're doing. So.
Thank you. So we've two routes we could take. We could open it up, which I want to, but not quite yet, if you guys are patient enough, because the route I'd like to put on this group as sort of carrying the mantle of Max forward is maybe to point to ways that you think we can marry the humanism that Max was trying to bring to spaces and places with the legacy of architecture that he put forward as well. I mean, I think contradictions, as Brian put forth on the table, are true, but it isn't that he left the modernism of the GSD entirely behind. He was very much formed by the architectural teaching that he received while he was there. And so I guess maybe a kind of, I don't know, this sounds like a dean's question of what might you point the next generation forward, or let's say our student audience forward to, that is still possible to marry the modernism, or let's say design, strong design, with space, place that are lived through humans. Stephen, go for it.
So, at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter protests, I called Sean and I said, we need to respond some way that isn't token, that isn't a one-off, that isn't meaningless. So we didn't write a one-time check to NOMA. We didn't go that route. What we did was we made a joint venture with the Bond Center, and we let our staff, working with the students at the Bond Center, explore spatial justice and do meaningful projects together. Nobody had to account for their time in my office. And we together, I think, began to test the notion that architecture, as it's been practiced for the past 3,000 years, is completely irrelevant today. And our clients are not our clients. Our clients are the people who depend on what we do for the quality of the spatial context of their lives. I think, Sean, you want to continue?
Well, I mean, I think when it comes to students and the future of practice, I think what Max, in that moral clarity, was also doing, as well as perhaps even practicing in the kind of Black radical tradition and imagination, particularly with regards to space and the production of space, and how that would perhaps change the lives of those whose current circumstances were not fully under their own control. And I think that understanding of power was essential. And to come back to Stephen's point, the reason that I was convinced, I think, by this idea was, in fact, that the power of the institution, as well as the profession that Stephen represented, and our ability to kind of question the institution together, the institution's position, the canons that it chooses to keep, the legacies that it chooses to endure, gave us an opportunity, I think, to both professionally and academically examine that and see how that might influence how things might, how those things might affect the future of practice, and how younger students might, in fact, choose or find paths in that questioning that might open up other opportunities for the practice to have more impact and more relevance.
Again, I'm going to come a little bit from left field on all of this, as I think Max would have, so I'm going to channel him a little bit. One of the advantages I think Max had from spending a lot of formative years as the only Black person in the room is that he quickly realized that he was as smart as anybody, and that there were people, white people, who were smart and white people who weren't so smart. And so he didn't suffer that he couldn't do whatever he wanted to do, or that people weren't bright that weren't necessarily from the academy. So Max listened to and cared about the people that he worked with. And I think in the final analysis, although Max could speak whatever language there was in terms of architecture, I think Max saw the clients, the people, many of whom were without power, as very important and equal to those who had a lot of power. And for him, I think architecture ultimately was about the people rather than the form itself. So rather than forcing people into preordained forms, and he was certainly facile in that way, more importantly, he found form that reflected the condition and the people that he was working with.
Just two things. So one is this question of, which is sort of a, I guess, a very inside baseball question, although we're in an architecture school, so we're inside the baseball. But the modernist question has always interested me, and I actually think, although I think Bond was part of a larger group of people who represented a lowercase p postmodernism, I think what's really interesting about Bond was that he learned modernism as a mode of design that was deep in its social commitments, and throughout his career held architecture to those social commitments. So in a way, he was much more of a modernist than a lot of his peers, who I think abandoned a lot of those social commitments. I mean, a lot of, historians argue that really from the moment of the International Style Exhibition, modernism was already sort of shedding those commitments. But I think it's really striking how much really he held modernism to those social commitments through the lens of racial justice. He didn't see that as marginal to the concerns of socially committed architects, but as central to them. And I think that's something, certainly many students in the last few years have expressed an interest in. And I would say the other sort of point to make is that, I will say I've had people tell me, Bond was really incredibly good leader, so smart, really socially committed, but not the best designer. And I think, what does that really mean? And I think what it means is that people are trained to think of design as something that's formal, and I happen to disagree with that. I think he was actually a very skilled formal designer, but I also think that that's a symptom of a devaluing of social concerns as the criteria by which we judge design. And I would argue, a beautiful building that, is terrible for the people who use it or who used to live on the site is actually pretty bad design. And I think Bond embodies, the notion that these two things are all constituent elements. The only other thing I'll say is doing this research, which this is a book about Bond, it's also a book about Black architects in many ways. And it is extremely clear that the history of Black architects in the United States has been one of pendulum swings. And, in '68, there was a moment when all of a sudden everybody cared about Black architects. And then by the '70s, it had slipped off the table. Same in the early kind of mid-'80s. And then by 1989, Robert Coles was writing essays like Black Architects and Endangered Species. So, we've seen this happen before. And I think when 2020 was happening, I will say, one of my comments was like, how long is this going to last, this moment of interest? And obviously, we're starting to see in broader culture a moment of disinterest in this stuff. And I think it's incredibly important for students to hold institutions' feet to the fire. And I think it's incredibly important for leaders of institutions like this to make the effort you're making to continue to put these at the center of the table, because certainly it's the easiest thing to slip off the table. So, and I think Bond gives a model really for how that can look.
That's beautifully put. Mo, you want to say something, and then I'll open it up.
Thank you. I wanted to make a comment about about something you said in your talk, and it has to do with Joseph Zaleski, whom you fingered as the guy who told him that. I'm surprised it was Joseph, but then, because I was thinking, who might it have been on the faculty who said that? Joseph gets a pass from me. Do you know his history?
Yeah.
I mean, he was Jewish, and his family was lost. He lost a lot of his family in the Holocaust, and he carried a serial number engraved on his arm, which we didn't know all about. We guessed when we were students, but we heard about that at his memorial service in the memorial church. So to me, he gets a little bit of a pass in sort of deciding, take this path and not that path, because the path may be blocked, as was his experience. Doesn't excuse it, it just explains it.
No, exactly. I mean, I think that that's an important point in that I think also just listening to your talk, Brian, which was both beautifully delivered but incredible history, is a way of also providing a background that deepens our understanding of Max's architecture and also his role in architecture culture and Black culture. I want to open it to questions from the audience. We don't have a lot of time, but please.
Hello, thank you so much for coming and for your wonderful talk. I'm curious just on the point of names and naming, just because that's the reason that we're here, particularly in the context of the Nexus, which you mentioned. I'm curious what insights you might offer to students that are currently in institutions that are fighting the kind of context of DEI, what words can be said or cannot be said, but particularly the GSD is choosing to change the name from African American Design Nexus to just the Design Nexus. And I'm really curious, like when we're thinking about legacies of institutional choices of harm and institutional histories of harm, how do we as students internalize the responsibility of holding on to work so that we're not beholden to the institution to make concessions on behalf of naming things or not naming things, changing them and not changing them? Just any insights on how students can be the ones to carry that institutional responsibility and kind of mirror that in our work and not be beholden on the institution to do that.
Can you repeat the last part of your question? I got the first 70%.
Yeah, just mostly just like how could we hold the work of an African American Design Nexus ourselves without having to like be beholden to the institution to calling it that or doing that specifically? Like how do we as Black students take care of our own legacies and our own contributions within the institution and not be beholden to the institution to say this is good or this is not good at this point in time or not in this point in time?
Well, I'm going to take that on, again, a slightly different way. I'm a skier. I have a house in Vermont, ski a lot. One of the things that's really a pleasure to me is driving through New Hampshire, Vermont towns in the middle of the winter at night with Eddie Palmieri and Miles Davis and Aretha playing. And I'm reminded of a lecture I went to with Nikki Giovanni. And in that lecture, a young man got up and said to Nikki, he said, I'm a poet. And if I write a poem about a sunset, is that Black? Nikki looked at him and said, did you write it? In other words, you own it. You own your space. Someone else said about Black people, there should be 10 of us everywhere, okay? You should feel very empowered in your work, in the integrity of your work, in your intellectual grounding. And yeah, it's nice to get names on things, and that's important too. But it's also important to be in the political space, like what's going on right now with this university and every other place. It doesn't mean you can't do both things, but don't count on somebody else to legitimize you. You wrote it.
Maybe just if we're using Bond as text, I would also point to a consistency in his life, which Ruth and Carrie, I'm sure, can shed even more light on, which is that he was very skeptical of institutions. I would never call him an institutionalist. From an early age, he was taught to be skeptical of things like clubs. That any institution was there to be, utilized, but not to be you. And so, that meant for him protesting apartheid at Columbia. It meant, criticizing City College when budgets were being slashed. It meant, this sort of always being a voice of conscience. and putting himself in spaces where he was often isolated, but took them as opportunities to speak. So I think a lesson of that is to remember, just as I think David has said very well, that you're an independent body in these entities, and they can. I think Bond used Harvard extremely well. He got an awful lot out of Harvard, and also, as Ruth told me, there's a reason why Ruth and Carrie went to Yale, not Harvard, right? So that's smart, right? It's not that he didn't get a ton out of this place, but I also think he knew that this place was a place where he would step up. But it wasn't him, and I think that's something that is useful for all of us to maybe remember in these tense situations. So.
Thank you.
Good. Yep.
So I sent notice of this event to two of my class members, both of whom happen to be summa cum laude as well. Of the class, I think we graduated 1,100 in the class of 1955, 15 of whom were summa cum laude. So that's a fairly small number up against 1,100 graduating students. So one of the classmates I sent it to, his name is Peter Malkin. I think his name is on the athletic center. Right, and he says, "Thank you, Arnold." He says, "A key fact: Max designed the addition to the Harvard Club of New York. Although I regret that the design was not consistent with the historic landmark main building designed by McKean, Mead, and White, it has worked well." So I wrote him back and said, "You own that. You own that remark, and I'm going to ask the panel what they think of it." Also, I want to say I didn't learn until I read something by Brian that Max had a love of staircases. Is that correct? Staircases? Yes.
There is a story about him at Tuskegee. I take some issue with this, but go ahead.
All right,
You're
yes. Well, I share his love of staircases. I want to say that. And when I was in college, I took two courses given by the Department of Architecture. One was the history of American architecture, and another one was called Space, Time, and Architecture. I can't remember the professor's name. Now, he would disagree with
that was Siegfried Gideon.
That professor would disagree with the comment that what happened 3,000 years ago in architecture wasn't important, because as I recall, he started talking about how they used spaces about 3,000, back in ancient Greece. Yes. Okay. Anyway, so anyone want to respond to Peter Malkin's?
The last question for a minute? So, to the graduating world. Okay, is that better? Okay, to the graduating world. God, good luck. We find ourselves in a world that has completely abandoned truth. And it's also abandoned risk-taking. So I'm a person of privilege, and Max was also a person of privilege. So let's be explicit about that. You got to, as Spike said, who, by the way, fired each of us 20 years apart, do the right thing, but take risks. What could go? What can happen? You start again. That's how I've lived my life, and I think it's worked out pretty well. Brian wants me to talk about the Harvard Club. That was a no-win situation. It was a complete damned if you do, damned if you don't. We were never going to do a classical building there. and it was, what was it, the 90s? Like, yeah. McKinley and White were wonderful, but they're long gone. And not being a Harvard guy, I've only been in the Harvard Club as a guest a couple of times. But it worked, but that edition worked really well, and the people who used it as a residence, or who do use it as a residence, really like it. People like Peter Walker and others who I know well. So my answer to that is, so what?
Well, you know, there used to be a commercial, some of you are old enough to remember this one, but when computers first started coming out, there was this commercial for, I don't remember which one, so maybe it wasn't such a good commercial, but at any rate, there were a pool of people at their various desktops out there, and there are a couple of guys standing out looking in at the pool, and one says to the other one, he says, which one do you think's the most powerful? And they said, well, that's easy, the one with the most gigabytes or whatever. And the guy said, no, I think it's the one they're using the most. And that was sort of how Apple got in front of everything else. So it isn't always about the form, it's also about how people use a space. So if people are comfortable with it, that's where Max was coming from, creating a space that people would be comfortable with. For Max, the architecture served the people, not the other way around.
And he learned that from our years in the together, because what was hammered into us was not necessarily about the modern movement or any other thing else. It was designed for the human scale, provide a variety of visual experiences, and integrate the visual arts, and and out of that comes whatever you create.
Yeah, I was just going to go back to the student's question and maybe pick up something that you, David, mentioned that, sure, Max was certainly, in terms of the design, focused on the people and their comfort. But I think as far as the institutional project, coming back to that question, Max made people uncomfortable as well, right? But that again, I'm going to come back to that moral clarity and not being passive in terms of the voice, but being quite active in the voice. The issue of naming is now upon all of us, not just your organization, mine, and others are now faced with this. But I do firmly believe that what I've learned from Max, again, through Brian's reading and the people who've worked with him, is in fact his willingness to question the institutional project. And so no matter what that project is, because that project's not consistent, it's the questioning of it, sometimes valid, sometimes perhaps not, or more importantly, a difference of opinion, which maintains the outside voices that would otherwise be diminished. So I think it's incredibly important that we recognize that, if anything, the questioning that Max would often do puts us in the position that we are in now to continue those lines of questions that others would not be so willing to ask.
That's beautifully put, Sean, and we're over time, so I'm going to end us there. But thank you, Brian, for a remarkable talk. And I want to, everyone here should keep an eye out for the publication when it comes out. So we will wait to have a copy in our hands. Thank you very much, and thank you to a great panel for an evening.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ken. Thank you.